To all those who say wrestling's all fake, tell that to the wrestlers who had to be escorted out of arenas by police during fan riots. These stories prove just how real it felt and how wild it could get. Some of the most unforgettable moments in wrestling history weren't just about what happened inside the ring, but what happened outside of it, in the stands, where fans let their emotions get the best of them. One of the most infamous examples of this happened in Detroit throughout the late 1960s and into the 1970s, a time when professional wrestling was divided into territories, and each region had its own stars, champions, and villains. On August 25, 1967, one of the earliest recorded riots occurred when the Sheik faced off against Bobo Brazil at the Olympia Stadium. In Detroit, the biggest name wasn't a hero, it was a villain, a man who thrived on chaos and fear. His name was the Sheik, and no one in Detroit hated anyone more than they hated him. The Sheik was a different kind of villain. He didn't just cheat to win, he made it feel like he was completely out of control. He rarely spoke English, choosing instead to grunt, growl, or shout in a language most fans didn't understand. He carried weapons, pencils, fire, anything he could get his hands on, and used them without hesitation. He fought dirty, and he did it all right in front of the referee, who was either too scared or too incompetent to stop him. The more the crowd booed, the more brutal he became. He wasn't just another bad guy in wrestling. He felt like something more dangerous, something real. Detroit wrestling fans weren't just casual viewers. They were emotionally invested. They came from working-class neighborhoods, and they saw wrestling as their escape. They loved their heroes and they hated their villains, and no one made their blood boil like the Sheik. Every time he stepped into the Olympia Stadium, the energy in the room shifted. The boos started the moment his music hit, and by the time he was in the ring, it was deafening. He fed off of it, knowing that their hatred made his matches even bigger events. But sometimes the hate became too much. Fans didn't just yell, they started throwing things. At first, it was small stuff, popcorn, paper cups, maybe a piece of torn-up program. But as the Sheik's matches went on and his antics became even more outrageous, the objects got bigger. Coins, beer bottles, chairs. Yes, actual chairs went flying toward the ring. Wrestlers had to dodge debris while trying to finish their matches. Security guards tried to keep the crowd under control, but when thousands of people were this angry, there wasn't much they could do. Fans ripped chairs from the stadium seating and hurled them toward the ring in a scene that looked more like a full-scale riot than a wrestling event. It got to the point where matches had to be cut short. It just wasn't safe. If the Sheik was winning, which he usually was, the riot would start before the match even ended. Some nights, fans tried to rush the ring themselves, determined to get their hands on the man who had made them so furious. On December 8, 1972, during another Sheik vs. Bobo Brazil match, the crowd became so uncontrollable that police were called in to escort the Sheik out of the building for his safety. The Sheik's ability to create this kind of chaos made him legendary. Promoters knew that as dangerous as these riots were, they also made for incredible business. The more people hated him, the more they bought tickets to see him. Even if it meant risking their own safety, they had to be there to witness the madness. Decades later, people still talk about the Detroit riots like they were some kind of war zone. The Sheik wasn't just another villain, he was a force of nature, a man so hated that crowds of thousands lost control just at the sight of him. It was wrestling at its most raw, at a time when people truly believed that what they were seeing was real. While Detroit may have had one of the most chaotic and dangerous wrestling scenes of its time, it wasn't the only place where things got out of control. On June 6, 1983, in Memphis, Tennessee, another wrestling riot took place, this time for a very different reason. Memphis wrestling was something special. It wasn't just about big guys throwing punches, it was about emotion, about personal stories that made the fans feel like they were part of the fight. And in Memphis, no one was more beloved than Jerry the King Lawler. He was their guy, the hometown hero who always stood up for what was right. But every hero needs a villain, and in the 1980s, Lawler had one of his biggest rivals in Bill Dundee. Dundee wasn't like the Sheik. He wasn't a silent monster who relied on fear. No, Dundee was the kind of guy who knew how to get under your skin just by talking. He didn't just play dirty in the ring, he insulted the fans directly. He called them pencil neck geeks, a phrase that might sound silly today, but was a serious insult back then. To the hardworking people of Memphis, it wasn't just an insult, it was personal. Dundee made it clear that he didn't respect them, that he thought he was better than them, and that he looked down on everything they stood for. Every time he wrestled Lawler, the crowd was at a fever pitch. And on that unforgettable night in June 1983, Dundee pushed things too far. He didn't just insult the fans, he tore them down. He mocked their accents, their clothes, their way of life. It wasn't just a wrestling promo, it was a full-scale attack on Memphis itself, and the fans lost it. The energy in the building was electric, dangerous. Now here's the next one. The 1980s was a wild time for professional wrestling, and Puerto Rico was one of the most intense places for it. Fans there didn't just watch wrestling, they felt every punch, every betrayal, every victory like it was happening to them personally. The World Wrestling Council, or WWC, was the biggest wrestling promotion on the island, and the crowds were some of the most passionate in the world. They lived for wrestling, and when something didn't sit right with them, they let it be known in ways that could turn dangerous in an instant. One of the most infamous wrestlers to ever step into a Puerto Rican ring was Bruiser Brody. He wasn't just another bad guy, he was a monster. Brody was wild, unpredictable, and violent. He didn't just play a villain, he became a force of chaos. Fans despised him, and that was exactly what he wanted. He wasn't interested in being the kind of bad guy that people love to hate. He wanted pure hatred, and he got it. He wasn't about mind games or sneaky tactics. He was about destruction. He was a storm that tore through opponents with brute force, and he struck fear into the crowd every time he entered the ring. There's one storyline in particular that took things to a whole new level of chaos, something known as the Great Fall of China. The details of this angle are fuzzy, even all these years later, but one thing is clear. It caused an absolute uproar. From what's been gathered, Brody took on an anti-China or anti-Asian stance in this storyline. It's unclear exactly how far it went, but given the tensions of the time, it hit a nerve. This was during the Cold War, and people were already on edge about global politics. It's possible that this storyline tapped into those fears, or that it simply came off as deeply offensive to certain fans. One thing's for sure, Puerto Rican fans were not happy about it. The people in that crowd weren't just watching a wrestling match. They were reacting to something that felt personal, something that felt real. At the shows where Brody played out this storyline, the crowds went from rowdy to downright dangerous. Booing and jeering were one thing, but these fans weren't stopping there. They started throwing things, and not just the usual trash or plastic cups. People were hurling heavier, more dangerous objects toward the ring. Security was completely overwhelmed. It wasn't just a few angry fans causing trouble. It was the entire crowd reacting as one, as if they had to defend something bigger than just a wrestling storyline. The energy in the arena wasn't just tense, it was on the verge of an all-out riot. Wrestlers, referees, and officials had to navigate a storm of flying debris, trying to avoid getting seriously hurt while still keeping the show moving forward. But at a certain point, there was no controlling the situation. It became clear that this wasn't just another night of wrestling. This was something else entirely. One wrestler recalled how the energy shifted the moment Brody walked into the ring. At first, the reaction was what you'd expect. Boos, curses, middle fingers from every direction. But then something changed. As Brody played up the storyline, mocking the crowd and embracing his role as the ultimate villain, the noise turned into something deeper, something more primal. People in the front rows clenched their fists, their faces turning red with anger. A bottle flew past Brody's head, smashing against the ring post. More objects followed, coins, shoes, whatever people could get their hands on. The referees signaled for security, but the few guards near the ring were outnumbered. Brody, ever the showman, leaned into it. He laughed, he sneered. He pointed at the crowd as if daring them to come at him. And that only made it worse. Fans in the upper section started to move down toward the barricades. The tension in the air was suffocating. Then someone jumped the barricade. Security rushed to stop him, but it was too late. More fans pushed forward, and suddenly the situation was completely out of control. The wrestlers in the back were told to stay put, unsure if stepping out into that chaos would make things worse. The riot had truly begun. The ring announcer tried to calm things down, but his voice was drowned out by the sound of the crowd. Wrestlers who had nothing to do with the match tried to get out of the building unnoticed, fearing they'd be caught up in the violence. Meanwhile, Brody stood in the ring, unfazed. He had seen wild crowds before, but this was different. This wasn't just heat. This was rage, raw and unfiltered. What happened during these events became part of wrestling history. The riots that broke out around Brody's matches only cemented Puerto Rico's reputation as one of the most passionate and volatile wrestling territories in the world. People still talk about those nights, about how wild the crowd became, about how the air felt electric with rage and energy. And at the center of it all was Bruiser Brody, the man who could turn a wrestling show into something that felt like a war zone. But looking back, there's also the question of whether it was all too much. Using real-world fears and political themes to get a reaction is nothing new in wrestling. But when it crosses a certain line, things can get out of hand fast. The Great Fall of China storyline clearly struck a nerve. But at what cost? The safety of everyone involved was put at risk, and it raised ethical questions about how far wrestling should go to push buttons. Brody was already known as an outlaw in the wrestling world, and this only added to his legend. But it also showed just how unpredictable wrestling can be when it taps into something deeply personal for its audience. The 1990s brought a new kind of chaos to professional wrestling, and nowhere was it more intense than in Philadelphia's ECW arena. Extreme Championship Wrestling wasn't just another wrestling company, it was a revolution. ECW fans were some of the most passionate and rowdy in the world. They didn't just watch wrestling, they lived it. The energy inside the ECW arena was wild, making the crowd as much a part of the show as the wrestlers themselves. It wasn't about one big riot. Instead, every night felt like one. The atmosphere was electric and unpredictable. Fans threw chairs into the ring, covering it in twisted metal. They shouted profanities at wrestlers, coming up with some of the most brutal and creative insults ever heard. Some fans even tried to get involved in the action, blurring the line between audience and performer. ECW embraced this madness. The company didn't try to control the chaos, it encouraged it. This wasn't just wrestling, it was raw, rebellious entertainment that felt real. Every match had an edge of danger, and every night in the ECW arena was an unforgettable experience. The fans, the wrestlers, and the extreme energy all came together to make ECW legendary. Wrestling has always been about more than just what happens in the ring. It's about passion, loyalty, and sometimes pure chaos. From the Sheik driving Detroit fans into a frenzy to Memphis crowds losing their minds over Bill Dundee's insults, these moments show just how real wrestling felt to the people watching. Whether it was Bruiser Brody stirring up rage in Puerto Rico or ECW fans turning every event into an unpredictable madhouse, the energy was electric. Fans weren't just watching, they were part of the action. They cheered, they booed, and sometimes they completely lost control. These wild moments prove just how powerful wrestling can be. It's not just a show, it's something people truly connect with. The best villains knew how to push buttons, and the most passionate fans responded in ways no one could predict. That's what made wrestling so special. It felt real because, in a way, it was. Today, things are a bit more controlled. Security is tighter, and full-blown riots aren't really a thing anymore. But the passion? That's still there. Wrestling fans still love their heroes and hate their villains. And while the chaos may not be as extreme, the energy and excitement that made these moments legendary are still very much alive. At the end of the day, that's what makes wrestling unforgettable. It's not just about the matches, it's about the moments, the reactions, and the emotions that keep fans coming back for more. Thanks for watching. Wrestling has always been about passion, and these unforgettable moments prove just how real it felt to the fans. If you enjoyed this deep dive into wrestling history, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. What's your favorite wild wrestling moment? Drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, keep the passion alive, and I'll see you in the next one.